In the autumn of 1993, on the set of Grumpy Old Men in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau stopped speaking to each other. Not for an afternoon. Not in the specific, temporary way of two people who have had a disagreement on a set and who have separated to manage the disagreement, and who will be professional again by the morning call. For weeks. The two men who had been friends for nearly 30 years, who had made 8 films together, and who were in the middle of making a 9th, stopped speaking to each other for weeks. In the specific way of people who have arrived at the point in a relationship where the thing that is breaking it has weight enough that the ordinary mechanisms of repair are not immediately available. The crew noticed. The crew noticed because crews always notice, and because the specific quality of the silence between Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau in the autumn of 1993 on the Minneapolis set was not the silence of two professionals who are between scenes and who have nothing in particular to say to each other. It was the silence of two people who have things to say and who are not saying them. And the texture of that silence is different from the ordinary silence, and the people who are in the vicinity of it understand the difference without being told what it is. The director, Donald Petrie, noticed. He managed it in the way of directors who are managing the specific situation of two lead actors who are in conflict, with the quiet efficiency of a professional who understands that the work has to continue, regardless of what is happening, between the people doing the work and who organizes the production around the reality of what is happening rather than around the reality he would prefer. The film was made. The film was released. It was commercially successful in a way that surprised some of the people who had observed the production and who had wondered, in the specific way of observers of difficult productions, whether what was happening on the set was going to be visible in what appeared on the screen. It was not visible. What appeared on the screen was the specific quality of two men who had been performing in each other's presence for 30 years and who had developed, across those 30 years, the specific quality of total mutual ease that is indistinguishable from genuine comfort regardless of what the people producing it are actually feeling about each other at the moment of its production. They were professionals. They had been professionals for longer than most of the crew had been alive. The professionalism held even when the relationship was not holding. That was the thing about Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau, that the story of their friendship requires to be understood at the beginning. The professionalism and the relationship were two different things, and the two different things were not always in alignment, and the professionalism could hold when the relationship was not holding in a way that the relationship alone without the professionalism could not have held. Tonight, my friend, I want to tell you the full story of Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. Not the public story, not the story of the odd couple and the grumpy old men, and the specific mythology of the Hollywood buddy partnership that the films and the interviews and the public appearances over 30 years had constructed, and that the public had received as the complete account of what the relationship was. The full story. The story of two men who needed each other in the specific way of people who find in another person the thing they most need and who spend 30 years discovering what the needing costs and what the costing means and what remains when the costing has been paid. Come with me. We are going back to two different beginnings because the story of Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau begins in two different places at nearly the same time and requires both places to be understood before the meeting of the two paths makes sense. John Euler Lemmon III was born on the 8th of February 1925 in Newton, Massachusetts, in the specific comfortable circumstances of the Massachusetts professional class. His father was the president of a donut company, which is a biographical detail that Jack Lemmon himself used for comic purposes across the length of a career that was organized, in significant measure, around the comic possibilities of the specific American middle-class world that he had come from. He was educated at private schools. He went to Harvard. He was, by the time he arrived in the professional theater after Harvard, the product of the specific combination of good family and good education and the specific quality of intelligence that the combination tends to produce, in the form of a man who understands the world he came from clearly enough to find it funny, and who has the specific technical equipment that the education provided to make the finding funny available to other people. He was funny from the beginning. Not the funny of someone who has learned to be funny as a social strategy, not the calculated deployment of humor in the service of the management of social situations. The genuine funny of a man whose intelligence expressed itself in the form of the observation of the absurdity that ordinary life contains, and who had the timing and the specificity and the physical intelligence to make that observation available to an audience in the specific, repeatable way of professional comedy. He was insecure. This is the fact about Jack Lemmon that his professional performances did not advertise, and that the people who knew him in private described with the consistency of people who had observed something real and specific. He was insecure in the specific way of very talented people, who are aware of their talent and who are also aware of the distance between the talent and what the talent requires to be fully expressed, and who experience the distance as a permanent state of not quite arriving at the thing that the talent is for. He was, in the private rooms of the professional life, a man who needed the reassurance that the talent was real, and that the work was good, and that the next production was going to be the one in which all of it came together in the way he felt it could come together. He needed this reassurance from the people around him, and he needed it with a consistency that the people around him were not always able to provide at the level the needing required. Walter Matthau was born on October 1st, 1920, in New York City. He was born Walter Matushanskyasky, which is the specific name that the subsequent accounts of his life have treated as the emblem of the specific quality of his origin: the Lower East Side Jewish immigrant family, the father who left when Walter was 3 years old, the mother who raised Walter and his brother Henry in the specific conditions of the Lower East Side in the 1920s and 1930s, which were the conditions of genuine poverty rather than the comfortable middle-class circumstances of Jack Lemmon's Newton, Massachusetts childhood. His father left when he was 3. The parallel with Loretta Young's father, who left when she was 3, is the specific coincidence that biography occasionally produces, and that is not more than a coincidence, but that is worth noting, because the 3-year-old who loses the father tends to organize the subsequent decades around the loss in ways that produce specific qualities in the adult. And Walter Matthau's specific qualities as an adult, the specific combination of self-sufficiency and the specific quality of the man who expects very little from the world and who is therefore pleasantly surprised rather than disappointed when the world provides anything, were the qualities of a man who had absorbed a specific lesson about the reliability of people very early and who had organized himself around the lesson with the efficiency of someone who has no alternative. He was, in the New York of the 1930s, the specific kind of young man that the Lower East Side of the Depression era produced, tough in the specific way of economic necessity rather than the theatrical way of performed toughness. Funny in the specific way of the people who have found that humor is the mechanism that makes difficult circumstances endurable, and who have developed the mechanism with the skill that the sustained necessity of it produces, and possessed of a quality of total, unself-conscious individuality that the people who encountered him consistently found both arresting and difficult to manage. He served in the Army Air Forces during the Second World War. He came back. He studied at the New School for Social Research on the GI Bill. He appeared in theater in New York, in the specific circuit of the New York stage in the late 1940s and early 1950s that was producing the performers who would eventually move to the larger commercial contexts that the theater's smaller commercial contexts were the preparation for. They met in 1966. The meeting was the meeting of two people who are in the same production for the first time and who discover in the specific context of the work that the production requires, that the work they are doing together is better than the work they have been doing apart, in the specific way of chemical compatibility, the quality of a reaction between two elements that produces something that neither element produces alone. The production was The Odd Couple, Neil Simon's play, directed by Mike Nichols on Broadway, in which Jack Lemmon played Felix Unger, the compulsively neat divorce who moves in with Walter Matthau's Oscar Madison, the compulsively messy sports writer, and in which the specific comic tension between the two characters is the comic tension of two people whose incompatibility is so complete that the comedy of it is the comedy of the extreme, rather than the ordinary. They were, in the rehearsals for The Odd Couple, immediately the thing that the play needed them to be, and that neither of them had been in quite this form with any previous partner. Not because the specific qualities they each brought were new. Lemmon had been bringing his specific quality of comic anxiety to roles since the mid-1950s, and Matthau had been bringing his specific quality of comic deflation to roles since the late 1940s. Because the two qualities together produced a third quality that was the product of the specific interaction between them, rather than the sum of the two individually. The play was a success. It ran for 964 performances. The film followed in 1968, and the partnership, the specific professional and personal partnership that the play had begun, was established in the way of things that are established when the conditions that establish them are exactly right. What the partnership required and what it produced, and what the producing of it cost, is the story I want to tell you now. And the story requires honesty about what the partnership was in its full dimensions, rather than the public mythology of two old friends who found comedy gold together, because the full dimensions include the things that the mythology does not include. Matthau gambled. This is the private fact about Walter Matthau that was known within his professional circle and that has been documented in the biographies and the accounts of the people who knew him, and that the public mythology of the genial, lovable, self-deprecating Walter Matthau tends to minimize in the way of mythologies that have organized themselves around the appealing version of a person. He gambled seriously, in the specific way that gambling becomes a governing activity rather than a recreational one. The way of someone for whom the gambling is the management of something rather than the enjoyment of something, for whom the specific quality of the bet and the outcome is providing something that the rest of the daily life is not providing. He lost enormous amounts of money. The accounts of the specific amounts vary, but the consistent fact across the accounts is that the amounts were large and the losing was sustained across a long period, and that the financial consequences of the gambling were real and serious in the way that the financial consequences of sustained, serious gambling in the specific amounts he was gambling tend to be. Jack Lemmon knew about the gambling. He knew because they were close enough that the knowledge was available, and because Matthau did not conduct the gambling with the specific secrecy that people who are ashamed of what they are doing tend to conduct it with. He knew, and he was troubled by it in the way of a man who cares about another person and who is watching that person do something that is damaging the person, and who is in the specific position of caring without having the capacity to change the thing the caring is observing. He also lent Matthau money. This is the specific fact about the financial dimension of the friendship that is most documented across the various accounts of the relationship. That Lemmon, who was more financially prudent and who had not organized his personal finances around the gambling, lent Matthau money in the specific context of the friendship's financial dimension, and that the lending was repeated rather than singular, and that the amounts were significant rather than token. The lending was not straightforwardly an act of generosity, though it was also an act of generosity. It was the specific act of a person who is in a friendship with someone who needs something and who has the capacity to provide it, and who provides it in the way that the friendship's emotional logic requires rather than in the way that the financial logic of the transaction would require if the transaction were purely financial, rather than the expression of a friendship. Matthau had a heart attack in 1966. He was 45 years old. He was in the middle of the production of The Odd Couple, not the Broadway production, but the film that was being prepared, the film that would be made in 1968. The heart attack required a recovery period, and the recovery period required the production to reorganize around the recovery, and the reorganizing produced the specific disruption that the productions of that era managed through the combination of insurance and scheduling flexibility and the goodwill of the other people in the production. Jack Lemmon visited him in the hospital. He visited him with the specific quality of the friend who shows up. The friend who's showing up is not the obligatory showing up of professional courtesy, but the showing up of someone who is genuinely concerned about the person in the hospital bed and who is not going to communicate the concern through the management of the concern, but through the presence. He sat with him, they talked. The quality of the talking, in the specific condition of the hospital and the recovery from the heart attack, was the quality of talking that hospital conversations between close friends produce, more direct than the ordinary talking, more honest about the things that the ordinary talking manages around, more willing to say the things that the specific condition of the mortality that the hospital contains makes relevant in a way that the ordinary daily conversation does not make them relevant. Matthau recovered. The film was made. And the specific quality of the relationship had been changed by the hospital visit in a way that the relationship would not have been changed if the heart attack had not happened. Deepened in the way that the encounters with mortality deepen the relationships that survive them and that are willing to be deepened by them. The films continued. The Front Page in 1974, The Sunshine Boys in 1975, The Odd Couple 2 in 1998, Grumpy Old Men in 1993, and Grumpier Old Men in 1995. Out to Sea in 1997. The films were the professional expression of the partnership, the specific commercial product that the partnership produced, and they were received across the 30 years of their making with the specific warmth that the public extends to something it has decided it loves and that it is consistently given the opportunity to love again. The warmth was genuine in the way that things that last for 30 years are genuine, not manufactured, not the product of the industry's management of an image, but the actual response of an actual audience to something that was actually giving them something they actually wanted. But the thing the films were giving the audience was not the thing the friendship was about, not in the complete sense. The films were giving the audience the public version of the partnership, the finished, professional, perfectly calibrated expression of what the chemistry between the two men produced when it was organized around the commercial requirements of a studio comedy. The friendship was something else, something that the films were the expression of and the product of, and also in some ways the management of. Matthau was difficult, not in the ordinary way, not in the way of actors who are difficult on sets in the specific standard forms that actor difficulty takes, in the specific personal way of a man who was carrying the things he was carrying, the gambling, the financial consequences of the gambling, the specific quality of the interior life that the gambling was managing, the heart that had failed once and that was going to fail again, and who expressed the carrying in the way that people who carry such things express them, which is not always in the direction of the people around them. He was caustic. He had the specific wit of a man for whom the observation of the absurdity of the world is the primary cognitive activity, and the wit operated in the private context with a quality of sharpness that the professional context managed. He could be dismissive. He could be the specific form of unkind that the genuinely witty can be when they deploy the wit in the direction of a specific person rather than in the general direction of the observation. Lemmon absorbed it. not always without response. There were the specific responses that the specific occasions produced, the disagreements and the set conflicts, and the weeks of silence in Minneapolis in 1993. But across the 30 years of the partnership, the dominant direction of the accommodation was in the direction of Lemmon accommodating Matthau rather than the reverse. And this was the specific asymmetry of the friendship that the public mythology of two compatible people who found each other and were perfectly matched tends to obscure. Lemmon loved Matthau more than Matthau needed Lemmon. This is the specific imbalance that the honest account of the friendship requires to be named. Because the naming of it is the thing that the account of what the friendship cost and why the title says it nearly destroyed them both is organized around. He loved him in the specific way of someone who has found in another person a quality that completes something in themselves. The specific quality that Matthau had of total unself-conscious ease in the world, of existing in the world without the specific anxiety about the existing that Lemmon carried, of being exactly what he was without the performance of being what he was, and without the need for the confirmation that the performance was being received in the way the performer needed it to be received. Matthau existed. He simply, totally, completely existed in the way that the people who simply exist are the most valuable and the most difficult people to be close to. Lemmon needed that. He needed it in the way that the person who is in the specific condition of insecurity and the need for external confirmation needs the presence of someone who does not operate in the economy of insecurity and confirmation. The presence of someone who is simply there, simply themselves, simply the thing they are, without the managing of the being it. The nearly destroying was the cost of the needing. The nearly destroying was the cost that the specific asymmetry of the needing imposed on the person who was doing the needing. In the way that loving someone more than they need you is always the more costly position. And in the way that loving someone who is difficult in the specific ways that Matthau was difficult was the specific form of costly that the loving of Matthau required. The 1993 silence on the Minneapolis set. The accounts of what produced the silence are not entirely consistent across the various sources, in the way of accounts of private conflicts between public people that are described by people who were in the vicinity rather than by the people themselves. What is consistent? There was a disagreement. The disagreement was about the work, about the specific way a scene should be played, about the specific understanding of what the scene required and what the character required, and what the other person in the scene was doing in relation to what the scene required. The disagreement produced the silence. The silence lasted weeks. They were on a film set together in Minneapolis, making a film together, and they were not speaking. The professional conduct of the production required them to be in scenes together and to play the relationship that the film required, the specific relationship of John and Max, the grumpy old men of the title. And they played it with the total professionalism of people who have been doing this for 30 years and who can produce the thing the work requires regardless of what the relationship outside the work is currently producing. They reconciled. They always reconciled. This is the other consistent fact about the Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau relationship across 30 years. That the conflicts and the silences and the specific disagreements, that the closeness of the relationship and the specific qualities of each of them in relation to each other produced, were always followed by the reconciliation in the way of relationships whose fundamental structure is strong enough to survive the specific damages that the relationship's content produces. The reconciliation in 1993 was the reconciliation that produced Grumpier Old Men in 1995 and Out to Sea in 1997 and The Odd Couple 2 in 1998. It was the reconciliation of two men who were in their 70s and who understood by the time they were in their 70s what the relationship was and what it was for and what the losing of it would cost in a way that the men in their 40s and 50s who had had the previous reconciliations had not yet fully understood. Matthau had a second heart attack, and then he had additional cardiac events in the years of the late 1990s. And the cardiac events were the events of a man whose body was telling him things about the remaining time, that the body of a man in his late 70s tells him, and that the mind receives with whatever the mind of a specific person receives the information of the remaining time with. He was dying. Not in the specific immediate sense of the terminal diagnosis, but in the general sense of a man whose body's signals were the signals of the diminishing. He died on July the 1st, 2000. He was 79 years old. He died at his home in Santa Monica of a heart failure. Jack Lemmon was informed. The reaction that Lemmon had to the death, the specific private reaction of a man who has lost the person he loved in the specific way he loved Matthau, was a reaction that the people around him described with the careful obliqueness of people who are describing grief that is genuine and deep, and that they are not going to make more available than the person grieving is making it available. He said publicly that Matthau was his best friend. He said this in the specific way of someone who is making the simplest and most accurate statement available, and who is doing so without the embellishment that the occasion might seem to invite. Because the simplest and most accurate statement is the one that the relationship had always been most honestly expressed in, not through the elaborate description of what the friendship was and what it meant, but through the simple, total fact of it. He said he would miss him every day. He was right. He died on June the 27th, 2001. He was 76 years old. He had survived Matthau by less than a year. The accounts of the final year of his life describe a man who was not well physically, and who was also, in the specific interior sense, in the condition of a man who has lost the organizing relationship of his professional and personal life, and who is navigating the existence that the loss has produced. He died 11 months after Matthau. The specific proximity of the deaths, the 11 months, is the fact that the people who loved them both have described with the specific quality of something that is not coincidence and is not destiny, but that is simply the fact that some relationships are so central to the people in them that the ending of the relationship and the ending of the person are not far apart. Now, my friend, let me sit with you in the meaning of the 30 years and the 8 films and the Minneapolis silence and the specific quality of a friendship that nearly destroyed them and that also sustained them. The nearly destroying was real. The asymmetry of the needing was real. The specific cost of loving someone more than they need you across 30 years of a professional partnership and a personal friendship that were both organized around the specific qualities of two men who were both genuinely exceptional and both genuinely difficult in their own ways, was the cost of something that cost something. The sustaining was also real. The work they made together was the work of two people, whose specific chemistry produced something that neither of them produced alone. And the something was real and was good and was received by the millions of people who watched it with the warmth of the genuine. The warmth that is not the product of the publicity, but the response to the thing itself. He loved him. He loved him in the specific, total 30-year way of someone who has organized a significant portion of their professional and personal life around the presence of another person, and who has received from that organization both the specific reward of the relationship and the specific cost of it. He missed him every day for 11 months, and then he was gone too. Sleep well, my friend, and the next time you see them together, in The Odd Couple, in Grumpy Old Men, in any of the 8 films that the 30 years produced, see the thing behind the chemistry. See the specific quality of two men who needed each other in different ways, and who gave each other what they could give, and who held on to what they had across 30 years of the holding being sometimes easy, and sometimes the hardest thing either of them was doing. The friendship nearly destroyed them. It also sustained them. Both of those things were true. Both of those things were the friendship.